Good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome for joining us tonight. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Donal Ryan and Dani Gill, and great timing on our part, or maybe Dani's part. She booked the date with Donal. We were delighted to see that he won the Novel of the Year last night for Strange Flowers. And just to let people know, we have added this to our book club collection just recently. So if you are a member of a book club and you want to read this, we do have multiple copies in stock. So I've just put in the comments box there as well. If you do have a question for Donal, you can just pop it into the comments box and Dani will pick them up as the interview progresses and we put them to Donal at the end. But otherwise, I'll hand you over to Dani Gill and Donal Ryan.
Thank you, Karen. So welcome to this event. It's been presented by Monaghan County Library Service and the Live Network, and I am Dani Gill and I am joined by author Donal Ryan. Donal, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Dani.
And congrats on the award. I know in your acknowledgements of Strange Flowers, the first people you actually thank are your readers, so it must be nice to pick up that award when it's selected by readers.
Oh yeah, it really is. That's what's so special about the Irish Book Awards. The fact that it's voted for by readers, and it's in huge numbers actually. I didn't realize how many people voted in the Irish Book Awards. It's great.
Yeah.
It's a real honor. It really is. Like, it really means an awful lot to me.
Yeah, the readers are so important and libraries are so important. Karen, thanks for arranging this event, and I think they've done great work this year connecting readers and writers and helping publishers. So I'm delighted to be here tonight, Donal, to talk about your book. Obviously, I've been a fan for a long time, since my Courch days and The Spinning Heart. I knew when I read that book it was very special and that you would be acclaimed in the years to come. So thank you for coming on to talk about it.
My pleasure.
I wanted to ask Donal, there are quite a few taboos in the book. Some of the obvious ones have been covered in the reviews, but I just wanted to ask about the setting of Tipperary, the 1970s. And I guess I'm thinking primarily at first about Alexander and the arrival of this man into the community and into the neighborhood. When you were setting out the narrative, was it, you're obviously attracted to Tipperary and you're a native of that area and you speak so well of kind of people from those places. When you started out with the book, was taboo immediately a central kind of a theme in the book, or was it still rooted in the place and that kind of came in? Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I think it came in gradually, and I don't think I ever considered consciously the term taboo or the idea of kind of creating a story that was replete with taboo subjects or things that people, sometimes shy away from or see as kind of being, transgressive or whatever. It's kind of hard to say why certain things occur to place in a story. But most of Strange Flowers is based fairly closely on things I've been familiar with myself or experienced or come across, at least obliquely. It's a very personal novel. It's literally close to home because it's set in a fictionalized version of my own home village in Tipperary, and the landscape and lexicon, of course, are extremely familiar to me, and they're easy to use. They're easy to draw on, for a story. But the idea of a Black Englishman living in North Tipperary, at first glance, it seems like, God, this is something that never would have happened. But it did happen. There were people from various parts of the world living in North Tipperary in the 70s and 60s and 50s because of the mines and silver mines and various industries around the place. I remember, in the mid-80s being in primary school, we moved from the village to nearby town of Nina and being in fourth class in school, and there was a black doctor in the hospital and his sons were coming to the school and they were maybe 17, 18. And we just stood, we stood at the railway, at the railing of the primary school yard, watching these guys walking in along to the secondary school, and with our mouths hanging up and thinking these were the coolest things we'd ever seen in our life, these two guys, because they were these tall black guys, we just thought they were just so different to us. And it was it never in a million years would have occurred to any of us to say anything derogatory about them or to be anything but awed by them, And it really surprised me, actually, when I saw Strange Flowers being reviewed, and some reviewers saying, God, Donal Ryan has really rose-tinted glasses when it comes to his native place. Somebody like Alexander would have been brutalized. One reviewer on radio was saying, it's kind of ridiculous the way he's portrayed the reaction to Alexander. But, maybe I'm just lucky to come from where I come from, but I know for a fact it wouldn't have happened. like you always have people, talking behind their hands and saying things behind people's backs. It's just human nature. It's never going to change. But overall, I mean, like, there's that element to it, I suppose, that you could say, the idea of a woman leaving her home and not talking about where she's gone, and having this raucous internal discourse that's never expressed. That for me is the real taboo. I mean, something we never approach in rural Ireland, or never did up until recently, is the idea of silence, of secrets, of things being allowed to be internalized, and never, and no one ever saying, we better draw it out, we better get it out there onto the table. And that's a very real thing for me. It's something I've experienced closely at first hand in my own life. And I think we all have. I think there's no getting away from it. So, the worst taboo is the one that's completely secret. It's completely excluded from view.
For sure. And I'm thinking about towards the end of the novel, that was a great twist. I'm sorry, there will be spoilers on this conversation because we're talking about the book. So you're going to have to selectively put your fingers in your ears. Because that is what we're here to talk about. But the relationship later, as we find out the nature of it between Moll and Ellen, was an interesting twist in the story. And also what happens to Lucas Jackman and the kind of collusion between them. Like, as the book progressed, I suppose I felt that there were so many questions, like you say, about what is the secret. And it seemed to be like new secrets kept turning up. And with that particular relationship, I liked it. I thought there was a lovely sensitivity in it. There's particular passages of the book that I think are some of my favorites. The bit towards the end with the fairy fort, and how you kind of peel back towards the end of the novel in reverse, kind of the sequence of events that have happened. So there's kind of a really nice stitching together there. But I guess that would also be, for me, from reading the book, I know a lot of the reviews focused on Alexander, but I felt when I read it that was probably the more controversial sort of hidden theme within the book, because it really makes sense then, the disintegration between the relationships and kind of what might have really happened. And there's a really lovely subtlety in how that's done.
Thanks, Dani. Yeah, I really, that was very important to me, actually, that I got that right. And I think it's probably the part of the novel that I worried most about as I wrote. Because I always try to not worry, when I write. I always think to myself, okay, this is the first draft and anything goes, anything can happen. No one's ever going to see it. And first drafts often get a kind of, a stronger life and a stronger pull on your consciousness than you intend them to have. And so when I was working that story out in my head, I was thinking, this is a big deal for a lot of people, and this is a very real thing for a lot of people. A kind of expression of who they really are, but it's still being occluded. It's still being subverted in a lot of ways, and that this is a life people have lived. And so I really thought to myself, I have to be very careful here about how this is described and how I go about not justifying Moll and Ellen, because they don't need to be justified, but how they would step around the obstacles that would be in the way of their relationship. And still having, the idea, I really wanted to have the idea of Kit knowing well all along something was going on. Because Kit has this kind of, at first glance, she is this almost a cipher of Irish rural woman of the mid-20th century. But in another way, she's very open-minded and she's very spiritual. And she's religious to the point where, the world of spirits is very real for her. And she's got this kind of expansive view of the universe. But she's still got this strangely, this very narrow prism. It's a strange combination of things. But again, I've seen that. I saw that in my own grandmother. Her being a really, really kind, generous person, and still prisming her view of the world through dogma.
Yeah, and I guess religion is there. Obviously, there's biblical titles applied to the book, and I'd wondered when I read it, was that something that you went back through and kind of thought this might be a nice kind of a thread to add? But obviously, you used biblical chapter titles, so I did wonder, from a narrative point of view, was religion there sort of by default based on where it's based and the era and everything, or were you kind of bringing it in to show, I guess, like you say, through Kit, more kind of a spiritual nature versus dogma and what was sort of allowed, not allowed?
Absolutely. And, you know, when you said by default, it really nails it. Because if you're going to describe a family of smallholders in rural Ireland in the 70s, it's going to be it's going to be the framework, you know, by which they live their lives. And also, the Elmwood family, you know, Moll's in-laws in London would be Pentecostalist Christians. And so they would be very well versed in the Bible. And, you know, the kind of people maybe they would be, you know, because I mean, everyone's particular. And there's a real danger when you describe a type of person that you engage in stereotypes and that you kind of present a homogenized vision of a group of people when everybody has completely particular, unique view of the universe and a unique particular way of living and way of being. But still, you know, I mean, there's a good chance that somebody like Barney or Delilah would have Bible verses ingrained in their minds and they'd be able to spit them out at will for certain situations. And I really wanted that part of the book to be, I wanted it to be a real living part of the construction of the book. And it gave me a really handy framework, to be honest, and a really handy way of dividing up the book. And I think all but one of the chapters are Bible books. I think Song of Songs isn't a book. I don't know why I thought it was, but anyway, it's not. But it's a really, it's such an important thing in the characters' lives that there's no way I could ignore it. But it became a very central theme of the book, all right.
Yeah, I liked how it was woven in, Donal, because what I thought about it was, it seemed that there was a feeling of kind of silent prayer in a lot of the book in terms of desperation, the ask, you know, the loss around initially Moll and then Joshua later, that kind of sense of hope and wanting to kind of have faith. But then also, like you say, Alexander talks about how he was raised and like he has the language of Catholicism and then away from Catholicism, but it kind of shows how he homogenizes into the life of Paddy and Kit particularly, because he kind of intuitively understands that for them as people, for him to kind of fit in as their son-in-law, this is part of it, you know, and he kind of goes along with that. And there's a lovely part at the end of the book where Ellen and Moll, it says that they're standing at the Holy Well and they're praying for their intentions and their sins. And I thought that was lovely because there is desire in the book, and I guess forbidden desire on a lot of levels, but then the acceptance that, you know, this is life, this is what's happening, you know, in every household and in every place. And in a way, the way that you've brought it in and woven it through the narrative, it feels quite gentle and kind of light touch. It's definitely subtler than a lot of stuff I would have read in other Irish fiction, where it feels like, I suppose, I'm thinking about, you know, Edna O'Brien and the way that she wrote about all of the kind of behaviors that would have been considered candid, but really there's so much truth in what she says and what she writes about that we kind of have to accept that. So I thought it was done really, really well, and it kind of floats in and out. It's very ethereal the way it floats in and out. I thought you did really well with it. Would you read, Donal, from The Blind Man? I asked if you might read from that particular section. It's a lovely section in the book. It's very poetic. It's just a couple of pages.
Yeah. So this is the story of the blind man. It's Josh's rewriting of the gospel story of the blind man. And he's using the story to try to impress Honey, who he's trying to woo in London. Josh is living in Egypt, so basically he's me from the 90s. He walked in the town when the sun was high and unrelenting, and his shadow was short. He had no staff, he had no cloak. His clacker still was safe in his clenched left hand. He thought for the first time about using it as a weapon, if he was seized again, about lashing out with it, about resisting these people who vied for his truth. He crossed the ford and started up his hill, and the hill seemed smaller than it had been in his imagination, and to be scuffed with scrub and thorny bushes. The path he'd always taken seemed narrower than in his mind, and threatened more along its edges by nettles. At this point, the blind man has regained he's been given sight. He crested the hill, and his heart settled a little at the sight of his tree. It was as wide and as high as he had measured with his hand and ear, and seemed to stand as steadfast on the slope as he had thought. pressing downwards and outwards with its roots. The ancient ruptures they had made ivied and moss to dark, welcoming green. But as he drew closer, he noticed that the leaves of the tree and the wood of its branches were speckled white, and the specks seemed to be moving. And he thought to close his eyes fast against this new dawning truth but he was drawn forward and down towards his dear tree, and he saw that its crown was a hazy diadem of whitefly, and that their maggots had infested all its branches and its leaves, and that the tree was dying. And he closed his eyes and listened, and he heard that its whispers were not offers of help, but implorations, that the tree was a beggar like him. He stumbled down the sunlit side and back across the ford, and saw coming towards him the followers of the one they called Messiah, and they were hooting and cheering as they approached. And he saw that some of them were lame and some diseased, and he wondered why their leader hadn't cured them, why he had seen fit instead to reserve his miracles for a beggar not known to him. And they were suddenly around him, and they were lifting him, and again, for the third time he was dragged and carried bodily away. And he closed his eyes again, because he did not want to see. They set him down before their leader, and their leader asked him, "Do you see?" The blind man answered that he did. The followers whooped and cheered and proclaimed, and some fell to their knees, and their eyes rolled in their heads as though in a kind of reverie. The leader ignored them. His gaze was fixed on the blind man who now could see, and he asked, "Do you believe that I am the Son of God?" This confused the blind man, and he was frightened and weary, and anger rose within him, like lava through a fissure in the earth, and he spat on the ground, and he said, "I didn't ask for this. Now let me be." And he was hurled to the ground again, and blows were rained on him, and the leader was shouting now, "Stop this, don't hurt him, don't hurt him." But they kept on hitting him, and he lashed out with his left hand, and it connected cleanly with someone's skull, and the finger piece of his clacker split in two and fell from his hand, and he gave up then and lay still and accepted their blows. As he slipped back to darkness, the blow stopped, and a new commotion started somewhere nearby. He heard the voices of the Pharisees and some of the townspeople, and he saw from the ground that they were ranged across the roadway on one side of him. And he turned his head and saw that the one they called Messiah and his followers were ranged across the roadway on the other side of him. He saw that their Messiah was still, and that he seemed sad, that his eyes were cast down, and that he didn't stand proud of his followers, but in the middle of them. The blind man could see that the Messiah seemed to be overwhelmed by his followers, and to have lost all his authority, and that he alone was silent, while the two groups traded insults and threats. The blind man felt a pain behind his eyes and a dimming of the light in them, and he knew at once that his sight was leaving him again, and he saw that the dust of the road around him was dark with his blood, and his blood was pooling outwards, and he felt that he was dying and was glad.
There's all kinds of irony, obviously, in that telling of that particular story. And I wondered, I suppose, I have a few questions about the blind man in the general narrative. But first one being, why did Josh choose to rewrite The Blind Man?
Because I did, to be honest. and so I give the story to Josh. And really, I needed Josh to have a story, and the story of the blind man became for Josh a story of denial, because when he's finished reading the story, he has this kind of outpouring of emotion, because he's been subverting his grief for his father for so long, and he's been trying to act through it and act out through it and not express it. Because I suppose, again, because of where he's from, I mean, it's not as though his grandparents would have stopped him from expressing himself. They would probably have encouraged it, but it never would have occurred to them to initiate it. They never would have said to him, "Sit down there, son, and tell us exactly what you feel. Tell us exactly what's on your mind," and they would have wanted to do it. But for some reason, they mightn't have had the words, they mightn't have had the lexicon, it mightn't have occurred to them. Because they might have been, they're probably from a put up and shut up type of background, basically, a place where these things are just kept still and inside a person. And so the blind man, like the blind man's, he's kind of happy. He leaves his home, he's blind, he knows he's a burden to his parents, so he leaves his home place and he goes and becomes a kind of happy beggar in a different place. And he lives underneath an olive tree, and he has a kind of peace in himself and a calm. And you know, I know this sounds terrible, but I think subconsciously, as I wrote that, I was thinking of a film I watched in the early 90s with Val Kilmer, where the main character is blind and has an operation to restore his sight. His life is ruined by his restored sight.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was somewhere in the back of my mind, but mainly the story itself was about denial and about, you know, the whole world being apparent to most people, and, you know, this kind of selective blindness, a kind of a willful blindness that we can all suffer from. I think it's a universal thing that there are certain things we will choose to be blind to, and certain things that are very apparent, you know, that should be very apparent to us, that we will remain blind to. I mean, this is something that I know that I've had searing experience of, you know, and the story for me was very real in that respect. But I know that that's a bit abstruse, that's a bit abstract, and I know that part of the book is a bit challenging, because it was for me as a writer, and so there's no reason why it shouldn't be for people as readers. I guess, I mean, you know, because every work of art is flawed, and, you know, and so
I loved it. I mean, I think on a lot of levels, I read in one of the interviews that you had said, all right, that the character of Josh you felt was kind of based on a younger version of yourself, you know, and obviously he's a writer and he attempts to write this story, and like you say, he's trying to impress Honey. But I think it works on a lot of levels. It's very clever. I think the irony in that particular piece of the Pharisees and the followers of Christ, and sort of how unempowered Jesus is in the scene, and through the story, the things that he uncovers as a seeing person, and how it kind of, like you say, destroys his world. You know, he sees the tree for being a beggar and all of the disease, and he sees the woman that he's kind of enjoyed time with, and she's a hag, and, you know, it's kind of horrible. You know, he's really, and he's getting dragged, you know, back and forth between the believers and the non-believers, and you know, really can't wait to like make his escape, which he eventually does towards the end. But it made me wonder, I guess, as a reader, you know, everyone has their own projections as a reader. It made me wonder when I read it, and then when I read the line about Josh and his mom, and when he says to her, "You didn't love Dad," and he knew it, you know. And we know obviously at this point that she's had, you know, albeit a late relationship with Ellen, who she had a flame for a very long time. But it made me kind of wonder, in a way, did he suspect, or did he know, or would he have thought that there was someone else, you know? And in that kind of, that's the only line I think we get on sort of the conversation they had to that effect. So I did wonder when I thought about the blind man, if it was also his own way of kind of figuring out secrets and what you know and don't know. And in a way, he was very hurt by the kind of the truth, as far as he felt it anyway, about their relationship, about Alexander and Moll. And obviously Alexander was very attentive and responsive to her, and for him it's painful, having lost, you know, the key male figure of Paddy initially, and then his dad. But there's only that one line. So I did wonder too, with the blind man, if there was a subtle kind of a hint in there, maybe, of him maybe knowing something more, albeit not, you know, not direct.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad. It's great you saw that, actually, Dani. I'm so glad you saw that, because I really meant that, because I wanted it to seem as though Josh wasn't sure why the story meant so much to him until the very end, until he actually had this kind of this huge explosion of grief at the end, and it becomes obvious to him what he was doing all along. And I mean, I had to kind of make the story seem like the kind of story I would have written when I was 21 or 22, if I, you know, because I mean, one of the main reasons the book begins in the mid-70s, because that's when I was born. And so I wanted Josh to be the same age I was when he's in London in the 90s. And I remember being in London in the 90s and having this schizoid existence of, on the one hand, thinking I was just fantastic and I was a talented writer who one day be a famous writer, and on the other hand, having no confidence in myself at all, and thinking everything about myself was stupid and ridiculous and hateful, you know, because I guess that's a common thing. I mean, that's not just me, but I really wanted to try to get that across with Josh, but to have him fall almost violently and suddenly in love with Honey, and just to be completely struck by her and smitten and almost aggressively in love with her.
Yeah, and there's an element of comedy in kind of her, you know, waiting for him to be done with this and kind of wondering when is he going to make a move, and listening to his story, and you get that lovely sense of his vulnerability. But also there is a kind of a story in him to tell, I guess, and it almost feels like, as a reader anyway, that he's not quite sure what exactly that story is, but he has a sense of it or a feel of it, which is maybe, you know, the power of a metaphor then too. The theme of like exile and, you know, prodigal, I suppose, it applies to him, to Josh, who goes off to London, and Moll previously, who goes off as well. I suppose I was wondering, with the theme of returning, does anyone really come home, or what is the concept of home in the book? Because Moll flees, you know, they're not sure why. She returns. She has this life then with Alexander, her parents, and the child. And then Josh flees, and we kind of get the sense towards the end of the book he's being returned. He's going to be forcibly returned, and he's kind of wanted at the home, particularly by Kit, I suppose, who's kind of wondering where he is. But it made me wonder not so much about the coming and the going, but what home meant in this particular novel, because I felt that a lot of that lovely warmth was coming from Paddy and Kit and this kind of very cozy, lovely cottage life they had. But it felt to some degree that Alexander comes along and he fits really nicely into that, but then he's always on the edge of Moll's bubble. And then to some extent, Josh is not within Moll's bubble either. And then Josh kind of has gone off and is trying to find his own way, but, you know, he's going to be swiftly returned to Ireland. So I wondered, in terms of home, like with Ellen towards the end of the book, when she's talking about this 10-day period that she hopes to have where her grandkids don't call and she gets to live, she says, kind of the truest expression of herself or whatever, you know, there's a really interesting sense of the home and outside of the home. And I suppose you've told it in a rural setting, in this very kind of cozy cottage vibe, but I felt that there was a real sense of the exile kind of seemed to continue, kind of seemed to go on through the book, really. I kind of wondered at the end of it, particularly, what the outcome of that was.
Well, you know, after all these years of writing books where the concept of home has been very central, I mean, it seems to me that the place where you're allowed to be your truest self is where you're going to be at home. And it doesn't matter where that is physically. But I mean, you know, I think because we live on a small island nation, the idea of exile and immigration and home are really resonant, always will be. Even before we had a concept of immigration, before we had immigrants in this country. I mean, in Achalim Lisinorak, there's fairies, people who leave for the fairy world for 7 years and come back and are changed irrevocably and have this new wisdom and this magical aura about them always, just as people who left for exotic places like America or Australia and came back, even, you know, come back as tourists to their home, had this exoticism about themselves. And even though, I mean, it seems to me that people who leave, a lot of people left Ireland in the 50s and came back expecting Ireland in the 50s and lived a 50s Irish life in their place of immigration. It's a huge thing. And it's going to be a theme that runs through all of our canon, I think, always, because of where we are in the world and who we are as a people and how our society functions. But like the idea of Moll's true home being Ellen Jackman's big house on the hill beside the hill where her parents' cottage is, for me, was very powerful. It was just across the meadow, a place where she was never really allowed to go when she was young, and which was fraught with danger for her because of Lucas Jackman's behavior when she was young. And now after all this time and all this struggle, you know, it has become her home. And for just for those 10 days, she can be truly at home because she can be truly herself. And that really was what I was trying to convey with that. And for Josh, he has no idea. You know, for Josh, I'm sure the cottage must have been unbearable. And I don't think this is expressed explicitly in the book, but I mean, Josh would have loved his grandparents dearly, of course, but to live in this tiny cottage with its stout walls and its stifling nature, you know, and its one main room and its small bedrooms. I mean, for a young lad who just wants to get out there and has this tumult of grief inside himself as well, and this tumult of longing and desire as well. You know, all those things, you know, in that feverish way that only a person at the cusp of adulthood can experience. It would have been unbearable for him, so he had to get out. But still, you know, the very last scene, the way it is, for me, was very important. It really was in that moment when I wrote it. and I wrote the book in a time of extreme grief. That last scene where the middle gate clangs open and Kit looks out the window and sees them coming, it was just so important for me to get that exactly right. I mean, it wasn't a huge struggle to get it right, but I knew when I wrote it that I had it right. That was just the way it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the fairy world, and there's mention of the fairy fort and the holy well, and obviously the immediate landscape of the grounds of the cottage and all of that kind of comes into it. There's sort of a slight tinge of mysticism, superstition that kind of is in there as well. Did that come in naturally, or did you make a conscious choice to kind of explore those?
It's kind of ever present for me in my life and in my fiction because of the way I was brought up. And I think it's because, and I know that, most of us here probably are from rural Irish backgrounds. Christianity became a palimpsest on paganism for Irish people and for lots of people around the world, where we twisted Christianity and Catholicism into a particular shape to suit our traditions. And holy wells were holy wells before there was a Christian tradition in Ireland. And all these places were sacred for different reasons going back. And Kit especially has this kind of this almost pagan faith, where she communes on a daily basis with her dead husband because she believes in his eternal spirit. And she has a framework of Catholic doctrine for this to explain it, but on a deeper level, at her core, on a cellular level, for her, it's a pagan experience, where she is communing with infinity, with different dimensions, with the totality of the universe, and not just what's in front of her. And that's a religious thing, but it's kind of a deeper faith than is corralled into Christianity. And even I'm a Christian myself, but it kind of slightly. For me, it was very important that that was magical. That the way kids saw the world, had magic in it. I mean, and the small things that were all through my childhood that existed, like my mother's own lovely superstitions. Really nice superstitions about luck and bad luck and what might be a harbinger of what. And a robin containing the soul of someone who was departed. And we all, I think, everybody has a story at some point of a butterfly at a funeral, say, or a robin appearing at the window the day after someone dies, or a crow just sitting on a fence, just staring at you, and you thinking to yourself, there's someone that's somebody who was bound for somewhere else. It's just, it's kind of a thing that's intuitive for most people.
Yeah, for sure. I was talking about this last week with someone talking about farming, and I just read Dermot Bolger's new collection of short stories, and I was just saying I'm from Longford originally, and there was a neighbour up the road who had apparently had the stopping of the blood as a healing kind of a power. Yeah. And I remember as a child it being totally normal that my best friend, her dad, who was a farmer, would ring from the field and there'd be a sheep in distress bleeding, and the mother would go on the phone and say whatever it was that she said. But we take it for granted massively. I think particularly in rural Ireland, these kind of practices are very common, and we probably don't think that they're strange at all. But I wonder, is it kind of rooted in, Celtic tradition? I think in Ireland there's a lot of that magic, and there's some amazing tales about that are very rooted to the stars, the land, that kind of portray the sense of our heritage and our people as being, the builders of Newgrange, and these kind of real grounded but kind of magical people with that sense of magic, And obviously Christianity anyway just took a lot of the pagan feast days. I still feel like a lot of Irish people have a sense almost on a deeper level of the pagan and the pagan tradition still. Yeah. I'm gonna open for questions in about 5 minutes. So if you have a question for Donal, don't be shy. Put it in the box, and we will discuss it. So I know there's lots of people watching and people who are readers and fans. So do put in your question, and we'll come to it in a few minutes. I wanted to ask Donal about fate. There was a line at the end of the book, I wrote it down here, that I liked. It's from Ellen. Weren't the lines of all maps drawn long before we lived? And it comes kind of late in the book. And I thought it was an interesting lens to kind of consider, because it felt in some way that she was referring to, I guess, the lack of choice. But in a lot of ways, they did make choices at critical times to do things. And there was a feeling in the book generally, I think, of a sort of almost intergenerational passing on of things to different characters, and I wondered that particular line, does it fall in there? In what way do you feel that line is meant to be read, or what way was it written?
The concept of free will and fate confound me, to be honest, and I think about them all the time. And it's funny, actually, you should mention that, because I remember my English teacher for Leaving Cert, Martin Slattery, and he rang me today, actually. I hadn't heard from him in years. He was a lovely man, and really a huge influence on me. And the first person said to me, "Ryan, you're a writer. That's what you are." And I remember him talking about this in civics class, about fate. And he said, "Lads, if you believe in destiny and you believe in fate and you believe that everything's mapped out, then no person can ever be blamed for anything they do." So he goes, we all have free will. At any given moment, we have complete freedom to act whatever way we feel we should act. And it was definitely, I've thought about that a lot ever since that day in civics class in about 1991. And I don't know, because I think a lot about time and the nature of time, and time actually being this thing that exists in the universe that might not exist, and how a universe can exist without time. And I mean, and there's a school of philosophy that says that there's only one eternal moment that we all exist in, an eternal present. And to what extent do our actions reverberate through infinity? And I mean, my instinctive faith is based on a concept of infinity, of an eternal soul. And I think that it seems to me sometimes as though this existence is some kind of a test, and there's a certain way we should behave. And maybe it's a thing that the Buddhists are right, and we get infinite chances at this life, and eventually we get it right. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, these are things that I can land into a story. These are concepts that I can take, and there's real joy in this, and real freedom. The fact that I can take the concept of fate and I can put it as a question in Ellen Jackman's head, and I don't need to answer it, because it's confounded me, and it always will. You confound everybody forever, basically. But it's nice that I can use it as a thing that Ellen Jackman considers. And and then the reader can come across it, and they can think about it.
Yeah. Well, are there any questions coming in there from our audience? I see one here. Okay, this is from Frank Donal. Considering the very personal, intimate, and local nature of your work, how does your community in Tipperary respond to the work? Good question.
I don't ask them. They don't tell me. No, actually, to be honest, I only ever seem to receive positive feedback for the most part. I mean, now and again, someone will take me to task on something. But my coverall excuse is that it's all made up. It's all fiction. They're all made up stories. But I think for the most part, I mean, I think the fact that I love the place where I'm from so much comes through in my work. And I mean, it could be set anywhere. Like the main reason I set all of my fiction in the same small area in North Tipperary is because the language and landscape are familiar enough for me not to feel sick as I write. Because my main issue with writing for all of my 20s, when I was young and free and single, and I could do what I wanted, and I could have written novel after novel if I wanted, but I spend most of my time wasting time the way young men do, is because whenever I wrote, I felt this queasiness because it always felt so fake. Because for some reason I was writing in a kind of slightly heightened middle-class English voice, because that's the way I thought a writer was supposed to sound. And it never occurred to me, bizarrely, never occurred to me, even though I'd read loads of literature written in demotic voices. It never occurred to me to do it. It never occurred to me to take my own accent and my own voice and to particularly construct words in a North Tip vernacular to make what I wrote seem right, to make it seem true. And until I, struck on that obvious expedient, I couldn't settle into the task of writing anything. So it made it feel real for me, and it made it feel, and it makes it easy, and it obviates the requirement for assiduous forensic research, which is something I don't like doing. No, I'm not lazy about it. I mistakenly said once that I was lazy about research, and it's been thrown back in my face over and over again ever since in reviews and by people on Twitter. And, so, I mean, it's just, I prefer to have a kind of ready-made verisimilitude. If I have to research, I'll do it, obviously. But now and again, people will, have... They won't have a go at me, but I remember one time I was doing a thing for TV3 in my home village, Newtown, and a local publican was outside his pub, and I came into the yard of the pub, and he went, "There's Donal Ryan on now," and he started to name characters from Spinning Heart, and then he started to say, "We're all Nike down the road." So he knows well that's him, and he was going through characters one by one, talking about how I insulted with that character. And the thing is, he was kind of hitting close to the truth now and again, like, and I was going to shut up. But like, the thing is, I mean, no matter what or where you write about, you are going to distill your own experience of people and relationships and life into your characters. There's no way to avoid it. I heard Colm Bean say once, we have to plunder and steal from our neighbours and friends and lovers and family. We've got no choice. What else can we do?
For sure. I mean, the more I read, the more I realise that all writers really are writing about their own experience, whatever way they're channeling it or whatever way they're choosing to do it. They at least have concerns or themes, or like you say, a language. I suppose it's lovely to read things from different geographical areas, even to get that sense of language. There have been so many great books published in Ireland in the last decade with interesting language. I'm thinking about City of Bahan and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. Donal, how do you feel about your book, Spinning Heart, being on the Leaving Certificate course?
It's not anymore, unfortunately. It's gone off this year. But it was great. For the 5 years I was on, actually, I really enjoyed it because I was asked to visit a lot of schools and to talk about it. And actually, in a way, it was a bit terrifying because I was thinking to myself, okay, if I go to a school and I speak to a room full of Leaving Cert students who are going to do a question at Leaving Cert on the Spinning Heart, if I say something, they're going to think, "Oh, geez, he wrote it. That has to be right. That has to be true. That's going to get me an A." I was thinking, an examiner might think that what I was saying was drivel, and they might interpret it completely wrongly. So, I had to really, warn students, like, not to quote me verbatim, because what the hell do I know? But it was great, though, and because, again, just to come back to my old teacher, Martin Slattery, I remember one day he said to us, "Lads, any one of ye could someday write a play or a poem or a novel that will be on Leaving Cert someday." And we're all going, yeah, right, no way. It was just great. Like, it was a real thrill. There's a real thrill to it. I remember the day I found out, actually. I found out because a teacher in Cork tweeted, I can't believe the Spinning Hearts on Leaving Cert because it's shit." I don't know how I came across this tweet, actually, but I saw it. I went, "What?" First of all, I was raging because he insulted the book, but secondly, I was just so happy. I was so thrilled to be on Leaving Cert because this is almost a magical thing. It's crazy.
Well, it's great to see contemporary Irish stuff there. When I was doing the Leaving Cert, there wasn't much contemporary Irish stuff, and I think there needs to be. I mean, there's so many great books being written. That's funny. Sometimes I wonder, that show where they make people read out tweets about them, mean tweets and stuff, sometimes I wonder, do you say something back to those people, or do you just,
God, Dani, it's a big question. Question. Do you respond to people? It's a vexing question. I've done it once or twice, and I always regret it. Like the day that The Strange Flowers came out, this writer in Dublin tweeted that he'd gone to Eason's and read 10 pages of it, and he said it was simple, juvenile bog opera. And he put this on Twitter. It's still there on Twitter, actually, if you want to look it up. And I said, I was really upset about it. I said, okay, look, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's only one guy saying this, But I was thinking, he's another writer. Why would a fellow writer do that? Like, I can never understand that about writers doing that. But then I saw him tweeting, atting the Guardian newspaper, and he was calling me lazy to the Guardian. This is a guy I never met. So I ended up speaking to him on the phone. I tracked him down. And we had a great conversation. And he was saying, like, Donal, I'm just so much better than you. I'm just so much better than you as a writer, and I just can't get a publishing deal, And he was really upset about this. And I was thinking, like, he's genuinely upset. There's no point in me now, being all bolshy and issuing threats and, teacher tweets and stuff like that.
Like, this is it. It says a lot that someone would go to a shop and read the first 10 pages and be really keen to give a review, and obviously coming from a place, of their own kind of stuff too. But yeah, I guess there's lots of interesting emojis that can be applied these days to.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that writers have any business judging our other writers, to be honest. I think we should leave it to the critics.
Yeah,
You don't see it in painting, you don't see it in music, you don't see it in any other art form. You only see it in literature for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. And sometimes I wonder about this. Like, I'm a writer myself. I'm a published poet, but I'm writing a debut novel at the moment. And sometimes there's just so much gossip behind the scenes in the poetry scene, particularly. And sometimes I think, wow, because it's such a niche scene. I mean, I'm advocating for poetry, so it will be less niche. Sometimes I think, wow, it's a fantastic amount of energy for this type of behavior. Because like you say,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, sorry, back to the questions. Someone else says, what do you like to read? I think this is a nice question, actually, because I always wonder it myself about writers. What do you like to read?
Well, I read everything, to be honest. And my first love was science fiction when I was a teenager. Well, before that was Roald Dahl. I just adored. And then I got into science fiction and James Herbert and Stephen King. And then I started to just read everything, really. And I read a lot of mid-century American fiction because my parents seemed to have somehow come across a job lot somewhere of Bellow and Norman Mailer and all these guys. And I loved them. And Updike as well, actually, later on. But lately I've been reading a lot of poetry, actually. And various poetry. I mean, Martin Dyer's maiden names I read and reread and reread. I've been reading Darren Griffith's poetry because I was familiar with her poetry, but I read her book, A Ghost in the Throat, and it's just this sublime work of art, And so I went back to Darren's poetry again. And I discovered Sharon Olds. Oh my God, she's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And you know what? She's just incredible. I mean, there's a poem there called, what's it called? It's a poem about a guy who is suicidal. He's on a ledge, and she wrote a poem about this guy being saved by cops in New York. And at the very end of the poem, one of the cops lights a cigarette and then gives it to the guy, and they all stand around. I mean, it's just the most incredible thing I've ever read. It's just so beautiful, and all of her work is so beautiful and so unflinching. She's just so fearless. She just gets right in there. She gets in there like her jealousy of her daughter's youth and beauty. That's dangerous territory, really. For anyone.
Yeah, great. Nice to hear you're a poetry fan. So another question there. Donal, have you always written, or have you ever had spells of writer's block? Yeah. And if so, how did you move past that? That's from Rachel.
Oh, Rachel, I've had terrible spells of it. I mean, I've had months and years sometimes of being completely incapable of writing. After I finished The Spinning Heart, actually, I didn't write for ages. And actually, I remember signing a deal. I signed a contract, and I was given, for me at the time, a fairly hefty amount of money to write 3 books, and quitting my job, and then being assailed by this massive panic and this absolute inability to write even a sentence. And I couldn't. It was so strange. I couldn't even write an email. I was getting emails. I could barely reply. I was replying to emails in pidgin English, in fragments, in single words. It was like I was literally monosyllabic. It's terrible, and you need to just relax, because I knew it was all in my head, And sometimes there are really simple exercises you can use, like opening any book and copying out a sentence from the book and writing that sentence over and over again. So you're actually physically engaged in the act of typing a sentence onto a screen, or writing a sentence with a biro onto paper, and then you're suddenly physically unblocked and unlocked, and then maybe choosing a single word and writing that single word over and over again until the word decides to expand itself into a sentence, and sometimes you just have to force yourself. And it's a very real thing, and sometimes I just feel I don't have anything to write about at the moment. And sometimes I get knocked off my stride by upset. We've had fairly huge upsets in our lives, my family, in the last few years. And some of those things are so huge that they just become all encompassing. And writing just seems like a futile aside to life. It just doesn't seem like something that's worth doing. It's always worth doing, of course, but sometimes there are things that are far more important.
That's a lovely tip about the writing of the single word. And sometimes I wonder that myself, about language being rudimentary and how much language we use in our day-to-day talking, and then trying to find the words is almost like a rejection of all other language to try and find the word. That's a nice tip. Might try that.
Really, that there's really more of that, Dani, that concept actually of trying of language being rudimentary, and us using just such a small lexicon in our daily lives, and then trying to expand that out into this huge thing in a poem or a song or a novel.
Yeah.
and excluding all our other words for the sake of one as well. And I always talk to my students actually about the tyranny of infinity, the fact that there's an infinite number of ways you can put the million words of English together in a sentence, or almost infinite anyway, or as good as infinite. And so you could end up thinking to yourself, well, if this is the sentence I wrote, couldn't it be a different sentence? Couldn't it be a different way? And you just have to divest yourself of that idea of it being something close to perfect. The idea of perfection is such a stymieing thing for artists, I think. We have to accept that all art is flawed. So there's no perfect piece of art.
Yeah.
The day the perfect piece of art exists, we can all hang our hat and forget about it.
Yeah, you'd be frozen. Yeah. There's a question in here from Anna. Lovely to join you this evening, Donal. Which of your novels is your personal favourite? Students have enjoyed The Spinning Heart. It's fantastic. Obviously, Anna must be a teacher. Hi, Anna. So which of your children do you love the most, Donal? Not a hard question.
Thanks, Anna, for that question. Thanks for teaching Spinning Heart. I think actually the thing about December, because the main character, John Z. Cunliffe, and it's a fairly tragic book, because my family loved him so much, because my mum and my wife and my sister just fell so in love with him, and because it's a book I wrote, and I know this sounds ridiculous. Another Twitter warrior actually having to go at me over this, and he kind of went on for a while actually, this guy did. But I wrote that book to impress Anne-Marie. There was no other reason for it. And because, I told her, I was like Josh and Honey, I convinced Anne-Marie I was a writer, and still there was no tangible evidence of my my assertion that I was a writer. And she was kind of sick of listening to me saying I was going to write a book. And so eventually, when she was pregnant with Thomas, our first child, she developed a pregnancy addiction to a TV show called America's Next Top Model. And it was on the Living Channel. It was on morning, noon, and night. And she had very bad morning sickness. She was off work, pregnancy sickness. She was watching this TV show nonstop. And so I'd come in from work and I'd start talking and, bushing and trying to get her attention. She was going, please, Tony, please, will you just go upstairs and write your fucking novel that you said you're going to write ever since I met you, And so it was a kind of, on the one hand, I was going, yeah, okay, right, I'll show her, I'll write my novel. And also really wanting to impress her because, she was my pregnant wife and I wanted her good opinion of me at all costs. I mean, I probably had it anyway, but I could cement it if I wrote a good book. But she started to like the book, and she started to love the book, and then she started to really feel a visceral connection to the character of John Z.
Yeah.
And he became so real. I remember the day that they rang me to say that we're going to publish The Spinning Heart before the thing about December. And I told my mum, and she started to cry. And she's not given to tears very much, I rarely see her crying. And she started to cry. She said, poor old John Z. Asher signs on the old creator, sure. That's the way he was treated his whole life. John Z he was never treated fairly. He was always pushed aside, wasn't he? And now it's happening again. And she was talking about him in such real terms that it was very gratifying for me and a bit spooky actually to have him feel so real for her.
That's brilliant. That's great. Anne-Marie seems to be still a first reader of yours, is she, with most of the stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if Anne-Marie doesn't like something, it can't go into the world. It just seems pointless for me putting into the world. Apparently, this makes me uxorious, and uxorious was seen as a failing apparently in Victorian times. For a man to be overly fond of his wife's opinion, or his wife or her opinion, or to court his wife's good opinion, apparently is to be uxorious. But call me uxorious, I don't care.
She must be very impressed by now, so Donal, with all of the books.
Yeah, she's mildly impressed now at this stage.
Okay, there's a question. Monaghan County Library is down here. Speaking of Twitter, did Donal see the hilarious thread by John Banville about him and the other Irish authors?
Yeah, it's not actually John Banville. I have a few suspicions about who it might be in reality, but it's not John Banville. But it's a very clever Twitter account. It's a John Banville parody account, and mostly it's Banville mourning the fact that the novel is dead. But he started to tweet a thread about me having a gang, being a gangster. And Kevin Barry and Julian Goff and Joseph O'Connor and Emer McBride were all in my gang. It's just, it's really funny. It's really funny.
I have another question actually about Lucas and what happens to Lucas. That's, an interesting moment in the book. Was that planned? When did you know that was going to happen to Lucas?
I knew Lucas was going to have a sticky end or a sticky semi-end. His life as himself is over in that moment. But I agonized about that. And I mean, it feels to me like, there's a part of the Spinning Heart where suddenly 3/4 of the way in there's a kidnapping, and I remember kind of shoehorning that in and kind of just trying to push away the knowledge that this wasn't quite right. This was a major flaw in the novel, and that that I was trying to squeeze this narrative thread in where it didn't really belong, because the book didn't seem novelistic enough to me. It's a stupid idea about it, and I might have been guilty of the same mistake when it came to what happens to Lucas. I think maybe if I was to write the book again, I might do that differently. But it seemed to work at the time, and it was a way of dispatching Lucas as the person that he was, and also, and in a way having this kind of black and white notion of good and evil, and because Lucas is quite cipher-like. Lucas isn't explored very much. He's a very wispy, phantom-like presence in the book, and he is a kind of a mechanism in the book. He's just a person who has to exist and be a certain way in order for certain things to happen and for certain people to behave in certain ways. And maybe if it was a longer book, he would have been fleshed out more. But I didn't want to. I didn't like him. I didn't. For me, he was just an embodiment of badness.
Might have written it differently. Like differently how? I'm just curious. What do you mean by that?
I mightn't have made him just a straight up representation of evil, and that's what he is in the book. He exists as this evil presence. He doesn't seem to have any redeeming qualities. Even when he's being kind to Alexander, you get the sense that there's something behind that. There's some ulterior, and he seems to be quite nice to Paddy, but Paddy's a very useful person for him. Paddy makes sure that he doesn't have to worry about his livestock or his farm. He can concentrate on his whatever he does and his horses.
Yeah.
And so Paddy for him mightn't even be human, and I wanted there to be a sense of his son Andrew almost heading in that direction and then pulling back, and becoming this very rounded, very decent human.
Yeah.
Because there are people, I do think that there are people who allow evil to overtake them, who allow themselves to do things that are unspeakable. I think this happens, we all know it happens. And but maybe I'd examine that more, maybe if I was to go back at it again.
I loved it. I loved the jam jars. Thought that was great. The jam jars and the blood.
I was happy with that. I really was happy with that. Yeah. And if she swung a tea towel full of jam jars at someone's head, which wouldn't kill him. Like, he has to be a really tough man not to die. I was thinking. But I checked it out. I spoke to a few doctors about it and a few people who would be in the know about head injuries.
Yeah, and the placing then of all the things around it, I loved that. There's a bit of kind of comedy in that. Of how does this look?
It's funny. I really had a visual sense of that in my head. I really had that mapped out in my head. The jam and the chainsaw and the tree and where it would be and where that would be in relation to the hillside and the oak trees and the cottage and how it could all happen without anybody seeing it or hearing it.
Yeah. A question in on the Spinning Heart, related to the Spinning Heart. Will there be a sequel to Spinning Heart?
And Marie and I have had a debate about this, actually ongoing at a kind of low level over the last few months, because I've been threatening to write a sequel to Spinning Heart, and Marie is saying, no, it could be a big mistake. And she quotes Irvin Welsh. Irvin Welsh he made a really stark, bold statement about his sequel to Trainspotting, saying, "I'm only doing it for the money." He kind of said, they're all going to fucking buy it, no matter how bad it is. It doesn't matter. I can write any kind of old shit, but once people hear it's a Trainspotting sequel, it's going to sell in big numbers. So Marie reckons, it'd be a cynical move to do it, but I really want to do it at some stage. I was even thinking of doing a Radiohead thing where I might do it and out of contract and let people pay whatever they think it's worth, whether it's a cent, a euro, or a fiver at some stage, because I wanted to tie up the loose ends. I wanted to go back to those characters because they feel like my foundational characters, even more so than Johnsy, because they're just kind of the core. It's a whole village. And also because people often say to me, Donal, will you please tell me, where's Bobby now? Is Bobby Mahon all right? And actually I brought Bobby back into different novels and short stories so people would know he's actually still alive, he's fine, didn't go to jail. Everybody found out it was the other guy who killed Frank, and Bobby was grand. But I didn't make that obvious enough at the end of Spinning Heart. See, I had this notion that I didn't want the novel to be too resolved. I wanted it to be such pristine representation of real life that resolution would make it fake. So I wanted it to be unresolved, and that was a big mistake, because I know when I come to the end of a book and something that's so big is left unsaid, unresolved, I go crazy. I do that horrible thing of throwing the book across the room if that happens. And so I don't know how I thought it was okay for me to do it.
Well, I suppose it's hard balance to strike, isn't it? You know, because I think people get attached to characters too, and they want more of them, you know, and you're the person who's generated them, so they're living inside your head first, and then you decide kind of what's happening, you know. But interesting to know there might be something in the pipeline. A couple of more questions here. Do you consciously write relatively short books, or is it just sheer skill to condense so much story?
I'd like to say it's just skill, it's a sublime talent that I have, but really because I have to compress my writing time because I have a full-time job as a lecturer at university. And I've never really been a full-time writer. You know, when I quit my job in civil service, I was for a few months, and then I started in UL pretty much straight away. And so I've never really had huge swathes of free time in which to write. And so it just seems expedient to write short books. But also, I think sometimes things can be padded out a bit too much. I think, you know, sometimes I think economy for me is kind of something that I strive for. I try to pack as much story into a paragraph or a sentence as I can. And it just seems, I don't know why, it just seems that my books seem to wind out at around 60,000 words. They all seem to come to the same spot, you know, they seem to end at the same size, at the same length. I don't know why it is.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something I have in my head because I was very struck when I read On Writing by Stephen King. Oh God, years. I was a teenager, I'd say, or maybe early 20s. And he said that when a writer gets to around 60,000 words, they're leaving short story territory and entering novella territory. And I was thinking, no bloody way, a short story could be that long, you know? It could be a novel or 3 novels. Because I knew that Of Mice and Men was 20,000 words. It was the shortest novel to ever win the Pulitzer. And I was thinking, that's 3 times the length of Mice and Men, which is definitely a novel, I think, anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe that number was just always in my head.
Yeah.
And now it's actually enshrined in contracts. Most of my contracts actually have that number in them, you know, that the book should be at least that length, I think.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, like, I generally get a bit worried when I see a really big book because most of the time I think they should have been edited more, you know, like you always find a section where you're like, no, this just doesn't belong, or, you know. So I love books of about that length. And I think there's a lot of room for it. Thinking about Banani Yoshimoto, you know, like Kitchen and Lizard and those kind of books where she puts the two kind of long short stories together into this sort of a weird, you know, overall book. And I think that's really interesting. You know, I think it's you need both, I guess.
Yeah.
And when the story is told, like, isn't it?
Yeah. That's it.
I think one more question. Yeah, this is a good final question, actually, Donal. What are you working on at the moment? From Frank Q.
Well, Frank, I finished the draft of a novel early on in the first lockdown, and I thought to myself, okay, you know, this looks like it's going to drag on for a while, so I can get this novel perfected. I didn't. I barely wrote at all actually for the last few months. So that draft of a novel still exists, and it's not finished. It's not readable. It wouldn't make sense to anybody except me and Anne-Marie because I can explain to her what stories with it. So I'm really, but you know, the draft exists, and I always feel a huge relief. I don't know how you feel about that, Danny, when you haven't got a first draft. When a first draft of something exists, whether it's a poem or a story or a novel, when a draft form exists, you know that you can do something with it, you know. But when something has ended and I've decided on what the ending is going to be, God, I just feel this real relief. You know, it feels weirdly finished, even in a ridiculously unreadable draft form, because all of the characters are there and all of the story exists in a kind of rudimentary form, and the resolution to the story exists.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be published apparently. It's got a working title of The Nearly Man, because that's what Anne-Marie calls me, because I've been shortlisted so many times for awards I didn't win, and you know, and also because I'm 5'11" and I always claimed to be 6 foot, knowing that I wasn't. But Anne-Marie measured me one night and she said, "God, you're actually 5'11" and a bit. You're really nearly man. You're nearly 6 foot." And so it just stuck. So it's not quite a pet name. It's more of a kind of just the name she calls me, basically.
Well, thanks, Donal. It's been lovely to chat, and thank you, audience, for your questions. Some lovely questions. Thanks to Karen at Monaghan County Library Service, and thank you also to the Live Network for helping produce this event. It's been lovely to chat.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Dani. Thanks, Karen.
I know I had said I wasn't going to come on at the end, but I just had to come on at the end and say thank you both so much. That was just absolutely fascinating viewing for the last hour. Thank you, Donal, for being so open and honest with your questions. And Dani, we'll maybe welcome you back whenever your new book is published. And best of luck with that to both of you, actually, for all your future work. We really enjoyed listening to you both tonight. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon, please God. Bye-bye.